Okay. Good morning, everybody, our audience joining us for this fantastic webinar on Africa and climate change. My name is Osek Eke. I am the Director for Global and Local Service Learning Programs at Penn Engineering. And on behalf of our Dean, Vijay Kumar, I'd like to welcome all of you to this fantastic program. Climate change is a threat to all of us. Those of us at Penn and Penn Engineering believe in the science and believe that we have an obligation to address the issues of climate change. And because this is a global issue, we have invited Professor Anthony Neong, the Director for Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. We're very privileged to have him here with us today. And we're having some technical issues. Our moderator for today's event is Dr. Tukufu Zuberi, and he'll be joining us very soon to help us guide us through this event. So let me just basically introduce Dr. Zuberi. That way, you know, have some background information about him. Dr. Zuberi is the Lasri Family Professor of Race Relations. Oh, there he is. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Fantastic. Glad you could join us. So I was just about to introduce you.
Okay.
So this is Dr. Zuberi, and he is the Lasri Family Professor of Race Relations and Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He is dedicated to bringing a fresh view of culture and society to the public through various platforms, such as guest lecturing at universities, television programs, and interactive social media. Currently, he works on human rights initiatives by participating in public speaking engagements, international collaborations with transnational organizations and individuals dedicated to human rights. Dr. Zuberi's research focuses on race, African and African diaspora populations. So we're very happy to have you here, sir, to moderate this event for us. Like I said,
it's my pleasure.
Fantastic.
I'm glad to join you in this space.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Our event today is co-sponsored by Perry World House, which is a clearinghouse and a center for all things international here at University of Pennsylvania. I want to give a special thanks to Michael Weisberg for helping us collaborate. Also, I want to thank Professor Simon Richter, the chairman of our Climate Week at Penn committee. And he is basically the engine that is helping us run through all our programs. And this week at the whole university, we have programs of varied topics. We have experts from around the world that will address the issue of climate change and global warming. So to help us navigate today's event, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Zuberi, who will introduce our special guest, Professor Nyong. Dr. Zuberi.
Am I not muted? Okay. Professor Nyong, Professor Eke, it's my pleasure to join you on this panel. I want to greet all of those who might be tuning in or who will tune in for joining us in what I think will be just a wonderful conversation. You know, this gentleman here is a senior executive fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, a chartered geographer, a fellow of the African Academy of Science, and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. He's been named as one of the top 20 of the 100 most influential people in climate policy in 2019 in the journal Apolitical. Professor Ngong is the Director of Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank. He has about 30 years of experience in environmental and natural resource management, environmental and social safeguards, renewable energy, and green growth that spans academia, the private sector, and development finance. Positions he has held at the African Development Bank include coordinator of the New Deal of Energy for Africa, head of the Renewable Energy Flagship, head of Gender, Climate Change and Sustainable Development, and head of Compliance and Safeguards. Before joining the bank, he was a senior climate change specialist at the International Development Research Center of Canada, and prior to that, as a professor of climate change at the University of Jos in Nigeria. We are truly fortunate to be in this space to talk to you about this critical moment in the future, and thinking about how what we have now in Africa and its relationship to the world and the changing kind of climate that we have, what kind of solutions and opportunities we can see in this moment. I've taken an opportunity to try to investigate how you have spoken about this subject, and I really am looking forward to your presentation because I've learned quite a bit from looking at what you have said in the past. So with that as a small introduction to someone who is working hard to think and imagine Africa's future in a changing climate, a changing world during the fourth industrial revolution, I give you Professor Ngong.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Prof. And thank you to Penn State University of Pennsylvania, and for inviting me to share my experience with you. It's been wonderful. I've known Jimmy, who introduced me. I'm sure he's tuned in. We've been close together, partners, associates, right from our undergraduate days. And this is something that is really very important to us, because when you ask most people the defining issues, global defining issues today, somehow climate change comes in. But I want to leave us with 5 key messages. In case I am not able to be coherent enough, at least let's take that these are the 5 key messages I'm trying to present. The first is that climate change is a global threat to development, and it's a threat to everywhere. But incidentally, because of Africa's poor capacity to manage it, it seems as if we now bear the brunt of the whole impacts of climate change, even though we're a minor contributor. The second message is that climate change, as negative as it looks, it has opportunities for us to do things right. The third message is that the fourth industrial revolution that we're currently on opens new frontiers to address the challenges of climate change and also to seize opportunities that climate change brings. I really want us to drive that agenda, because Africa missed out on the first revolution, industrial revolution, missed out on the second, missed out on the third. We can't afford to miss out on this with the opportunities that it brings. The fourth is that the African Development Bank is leading the drive to tackle climate change in Africa. The reason being, the only reason the African Development Bank was established was to bring about sustainable development on the continent. And anything that threatens that mission threatens our very existence. And climate change is a threat to development and a threat to our mission. So we face it very directly. Last message is that universities and research institutions like you that you've organized this, you have a role to play. You can expand Africa's access to climate change opportunities through a forward-looking curriculum. Are we training the students of tomorrow? I think that's where we come in there. Let me I tell us global because it's a global seminar looking at what happens in the global space. This is a 2020 publication of the World Economic Forum. For those of you that are familiar with the World Economic Forum, you know it's one of those top-notch think tanks around the world. It's when it says this, you ask who said it, they say World Economic Forum. So okay, you know, for some reason. So what we find here on the top are top 5 global risks in terms of likelihood of occurrence. And the bottom bit shows the global risks, top 5 global risks in terms of impact. And they trusted they have been keeping this record from 2007 till now 2020. You notice in terms of likelihood of occurrences, it's been largely economic, a little bit of technology, the risk. But as it's progressing, you see much of it becoming green, which means environmental risks are now becoming the predominant risk going on. The same thing with the impacts. When you look also towards the left, you see a lot of economic things, but as we progress into the 2010, 11, 12, 16, you see a lot of it now still become environmental. Then when you look at the ones that are red, water crisis, what drives water crisis better than climate change? So if you put those as environmental, you realize that almost all the risks, every one, the top 5 risks have to do with the environment. And that's the world we have gone into. We are in a COVID world. And I can tell you that for some reason, when you look at the relationship between humans, wildlife, animal, we can find a link where COVID comes into that space, largely environmental. So I thought I should bring this up so we know exactly where the threats are coming from. But let me take one of those basically environmental risks, which is climate change. I wanted to position where it is. You find that there's a strong correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, the increase in temperature. And these greenhouse gas emissions come from everything we do normally, the cars we drive, the combustion from the engines, the deforestation that people cause in the villages, you know, the generator fumes we do, you know, the poor farming practices, name them. These are everyday things we do. The livestock that emit methane, the garbage we leave outside, you know, for a while. All these are things that contribute to the increase in carbon dioxide that we're seeing. And there's a correlation. So the graph on the left basically says, look, from when we began to have instrumental records in 1900, we've plotted to see how the temperature has been increasing relative to a certain period. And the orange line says, if we are not careful, if we let things go the way they are with a high emission, then we might hit between 4 and 5 degrees Celsius increase. That's terrible. For most of us who've seen the impacts of climate change, you will agree with me that we can't afford to say, let's wait to hit that temperature range. We're already seeing losses in agriculture, losses in livestock, all manner of things happening because of that. So what the international community is doing is to say, how can we achieve that blue line? By forcing emissions reductions. Then when you look at the right, the last graph I have there shows the hottest years in history. They're getting, when we had 2014, we said, thank God, that was hot. 2015, 16, 17 came, and they have all been increasing. So that's where we are. And another global picture I want us to look at is the weather-related losses worldwide. This is huge. If we think that we've lost so much with COVID-19, let's take a look again. When the climate change disaster happens, we lose a lot. But we pay more attention to some of these other issues than we pay to climate change. Climate change could wipe out 2.5 trillion of the world's financial assets if we do not keep global temperature within that blue line I showed, within 2 degrees. This is just financial assets, 2.5 trillion. We're not talking about human lives, we're not talking about other non-financial assets. So it is very important that we pay closer attention to climate change. Now coming home to Africa, the graph on the left is very interesting to me because it shows where the emissions come from, largely from fossil fuels, which is the main source of emission globally. You see that Africa is really not featuring there, except South Africa, which is not also that bad. But when you look at the graph to the right, you see that's a vulnerability index for the same year. You see that the African continent, sub-Saharan African largely, owns that vulnerability, extremely very vulnerable. When you compare that to the fact that they are a very minor emitter, contributor to global warming, as you can see on the left, then it gives us cause for concern. What can we do? Because of that vulnerability, we're having a lot of challenges, a lot of risks. And so on the left, you find the climate hazards, extreme temperature rises we're seeing that happening across the world. This year, France and co recorded 43, 44 degrees Celsius, unthinkable. Places that never could imagine temperatures that high. And because they are not prepared, loss of death. We also find that in Africa. A lot of places became extremely hot, temperatures increased. We had droughts. We're still having droughts a lot in several parts. The Sahel, the Horn of Africa to the east, Eastern Africa, we are seeing drought. We are seeing precipitations, heavy increase in rainfall. If you're following the news, you know what is happening in Sudan at the moment. You know what's happening in some parts of northern Nigeria at the moment. A lot of flooding, lots of lives lost. Sea level rise, we're seeing that happen. We are seeing torrential rains and winds destroying, like the cyclones we had in Hurricane Idai that happened in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and we're finding these things happening, and it's real. Then what is it causing us? We're seeing crop failures. We're seeing extended land degradations. And don't forget that we have about 600 million farmers in Africa who rely on rain-fed agriculture, which means if it rains, they farm, they eat. If it doesn't rain, there's famine, there's drought, there's famine, and they starve. Then we also have a lot of the youths who are affected, who themselves are into some form of agriculture. We see conflicts, a lot of conflicts. For instance, the pastoralists and the farmers competing for limited resources that have been degraded by climate change. We see migrations, rural-urban migrations, cross-border international migrations. We've told ourselves at the African Development Bank that the future of African youth is in Africa, not at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Many of them, in a bid to cross to go to where there might be better life, they die and sink into the Mediterranean. That's not where African youths belong. African youths belong on the African continent, having decent jobs, different livelihoods, and we need to do that and provide that for them. Now, some of those very specific things we talked about, I'll skip through this. If you look at the pyramid to the right, this is a treasure of Sudan. This is their history. This is where they have tourism coming in. If you look bottom, you are going to see erosion and all manner of things happening there. Why? Because the rise in the level of the Nile is pouring, taking water into that. On the left, you see desert locusts. For those who come from Eastern Africa, this is an army. They cover 150 kilometers a day, devastate everything in sight. Climate change brings this up. Then last year we had Hurricane Idai that we lost about 1,000 people. Infrastructure, what about $2 billion was lost. They are yet to recover, heading into another monsoon season. So I think it is important for us to realize that climate change is not that exotic thing we talked about. It is real. Then we have hotspots for conflict. We are seeing climate-induced degradation of freshwater resources leading to conflict. We are seeing climate-induced decline in food production leading to conflict. We're seeing environmentally induced migration. These are not good signs for us on the African continent. Then let me also talk briefly about the climate change and the financial sector, because everything boils down to money. Money is the glue that ties all the the innovations, the investments we want to talk about in dealing with them. We are beginning to see a serious volatility in the financial sector. When people say climate change is an environmental threat, I smile because I know, yes, it could be environmental, but the impact is felt in the economy, and that's very serious. When you look at the hazard patterns we've seen, insurance is highly affected. For those of you that own homes and other things, you realize that after Hurricane Katrina, insurance premiums went up. And what happens? Many people cannot afford to pay it. So you have a larger proportion of uninsurable risks being there. Then the pension and sovereign wealth funds, what do? They invest. A lot of that investment went into where we had Hurricane Idai. And then the hurricane wipes out all that investment because nobody took into consideration the potentials for climate change impact in that investment. That's investment lost. Where those monies were borrowed from banks, we are seeing default risks. People are not able to pay. And many of these default risks affect the financial stability of that country. It lowers your rating. Investors can come in because your rating is low. So climate change is economy-wide. It affects everyone. Then what would it take us to adapt to manage these impacts? If we can control our emissions and keep it below 2 degrees as everyone is pushing, then it means by 2050, we'll be looking at about $50 billion per annum to address climate change issues in Africa. We don't have such monies. So there's a global effort to make sure that that money is available. But the money is available. Africa only accesses 3% of the total resources that are available. This is not right. I normally joke about this, that if it was a soccer tournament, we probably would be playing in Division 5, Division 6. 3% total for 54 African countries. There are many reasons I know for this. The capacity, the absorptive capacity, the ability to write good proposals, ability to articulate what the issues are and design good projects. There are so many of these things that are influencing our ability to get this money. So like I said, the international community is concerned that the impacts of climate change could annul or reverse most of what we've done. So recently, by 2015, two major decisions, two major events took place. The first was the Agenda 2030 program, which led to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, where one goal was particularly dedicated to fighting climate change, SDG 13. That same year, in December of that same year, this happened in September, then the Paris Agreement was signed in December. All 54 African countries signed, committing to submit nationally determined contributions. We're not the only ones, the whole world, basically. It's just now that the US, that President Donald Trump has pulled the US out of this, but it's a global initiative that we need to come together to be able to address climate change. We need to commit ourselves individually as countries to cut down emissions. So that shows that the international community is keen to address issues of climate change. But like I've said, the challenge is very clear. It's seriously impacting our way of life, impact unevenly spread. Poor Africa that is not contributing bears the bulk of the impact because of its limited capacity to adapt. And having said that, we've seen all those doom. But let me mention here that climate change is not all about doom and gloom. There are opportunities that come with it. We need to identify those opportunities. One, there's an opportunity to drive a climate resilient, low carbon development. that boost growth. We realize that many things have gone wrong. The carbon dioxide we breathe in, the cardiac arrest, many deaths that have been recorded associated with climate change are things we could have avoided if we had a cleaner development pathway. It also helps us to stimulate growth. It helps us to scale up renewable energy, which I'm going to talk about, because if there wasn't the issue of climate change, coal would have been very okay, heavy oils would have been okay. But because of climate change, we're now looking inwards to see what are the potential renewable energy sources that we have that we've left untapped. And you see that Africa is a winner when it comes to that. So I'm going to look at 5 quick areas where we have opportunities. The first is agriculture. 25% of the world's undeveloped arable land is in Africa. And yet we spend $35 billion a year importing food, which means there is a market here for 35 billion, which we need entrepreneurs to come in and harvest that market. We spend that. And this is a continent, like the president of the African Development Bank says usually, if you throw a seed in the air, by the time it lands on the ground, it's already germinated because we have that. We have opportunities to take our agricultural output from $280 billion per annum to about 800 billion by 2030. This is important. These are opportunities for young people and agripreneurs or entrepreneurs to get into. Like I've talked about the importation of food. We have processes, we have operations in climate smart agriculture that gives you a double win. It reduces emission and it builds resilience. And we need to take advantage of these opportunities to improve our agriculture. The one that made it is energy. We have so much energy potentials, but potentials don't drive industries, potentials don't drive factories, potentials don't drive economy. They have to be harnessed. There is no reason why several African countries, only 5% of the urban population have access to clean energy. Rural population, 0. When we have so much solar, so much hydro, so much wind, so much geothermal. For those who have oil, they have depended so much on that oil that now that the price of crude has dropped, most of the economies have collapsed. We have green hydrogen, which we have so much potentials for. And I think Africa can take the lead in some of this. I'll give you an instance. We had when the cell phones came, we did not fully, it wasn't, the telephone lines were not fully available to everyone. But when the cell phones came, East Africa, Nairobi, Kenya specifically, took advantage of it. Not only have we had a very strong penetration of cell phones in Africa, but they developed a product that has gone global, mobile money, through that process. We leapfrogged the landlines, leapfrogged it into the cell phones, leapfrogged most standard banks, and leapfrogged into mobile money. Africa led the way. And I believe that we can do that again in climate change. Then for the cities, we are growing, we're urbanizing. Most of the energy-related global greenhouse emissions, about 71 to 76%, are from the urban centers. This is where we can deal with smart cities. It's important, it's an opportunity for us to build our cities and build our cities right, thereby controlling the air quality and the public health, and then enhancing safety within our communities. Then there's opportunities for the financial sector. African countries have submitted what I call that nationally determined contributions that talks about the things they will do to address climate change. When we did an assessment of those nationally determined contributions, we saw investment opportunities of about $3 trillion by 2030. these are investment opportunities. We have investment opportunities in renewable energy. We have, so there are opportunities out there. There are resources for them. There's bank issuance. We have bonds. We have all manner of resources that could allow people to tap into these investment opportunities. Then the last is the fourth industrial revolution. I've mentioned it earlier to colleagues. Africa lost out in the first industrial revolution. We're not there. We're not there in the second. We're not there in the third. We're not there. We're not there in this fourth. When you look at where things have happened, we realize we need to do a lot more to take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. The lecture that I gave at the University of Calabar was largely on this, so I would suggest if you have that presentation or the booklet, please take a look at it. But climate change and digitalization are two major drivers of disruption in industrial processes that underscore development planning. So it is important for us to realize that the intersection between climate change and the digital era we have today has significant knock-on effects that will support industrialization, generate emerging opportunities, and create applications to address climate change. The fourth industrial revolution allows us to create new solution spaces, which is what climate change needs. You need to think outside the box to be able to address climate change. We have not seen it before. The climate of 5 years ago is not the climate we're going to see in the next 5 years. And we cannot wait until we see it to plan for it. We need to plan, we need to think outside the box. And the fourth industrial revolution gives us the opportunity to do that. I'll just give you one way in which the fourth industrial revolution could support agriculture and thereby achieve 7 of those sustainable development goals. These are opportunities that Africa has. You look at artificial intelligence and machine learning. We're seeing applications in plant breeding to speed varietal selection. We're seeing robots, are reducing applications of input by over 90%. Right here on the African continent, I can tell you there are some smart young chaps we are financing who are farmers. They tell themselves they are not farmers, they are agripreneurs, they are businessmen. They don't go to the farm. They have bow ties like my president here. They stay in the comfort of their offices and do the soil analysis of your farm, and then they send out the drones to put fertilizers exactly where they need which type of fertilizer, and to plant seed exactly where they need to plant. And they're doing that from the comfort of their homes or the comfort of their offices and bringing back the drones home. Precision farming, the opportunities there. So I've talked about the drones to monitor crops, soil conditions, and so on. Then you have the Internet of Things. You cannot reach the farmers if you don't have a database of farmers. And this requires big data, Internet of Things. We're seeing people using 3D printing to fabricate parts for machineries. We're seeing blockchain technologies being used for food traceability. People talk about fair trade. They use this blockchain to trace their product exactly from the source to the end to where it's supposed to be consumed, to make sure that those agri-products do not have child labor, do not involve blood money and all that. This is extremely very good. I'll soon round up. The African Development Bank, like I've said, is very important to us. We have 5 key strategies that we're working on to support Africa's development. The first is to light up and power Africa. Without power, Africa can go nowhere. We know that. Even insects follow where there's light. Insects don't stay in the dark. They go to where there's light. So the second is feed Africa. Like I've said, why should we have import food worth $35 billion every year? The third is industrialize Africa. We have the lowest industrial base on earth. you cannot grow if you can't manufacture your processes and your products. The fourth is integrate Africa. Movements, goods, services. If we can increase our trade within Africa, then we will have no problem. And that's why the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement has stood. We've been behind it for years. Then the fifth is improve the quality of the lives of Africa's people. Our jobs, our youths need to be taken care of. So we have targets, and those targets are that climate change targets that by 2020, at least 40% of our total financing, and we do about $10 billion a year, 40% of that must be dedicated to climate change. So 40 billion, 4 billion every year. We are almost there. The second target is that by 2025, we would mobilize at least $25 billion in climate finance to support climate change. And the third is that we will have to screen all our projects for climate risk. All risky projects, we build resilience into them. Projects that would emit very high intensities of carbon dioxide, we look for alternatives. Then we make sure that at least 50% of our investments go for adaptation because of Africa's high vulnerability. I'll leave this as a scorecard to show how we have fared concerning those targets. We're not doing too badly, but we'll still need support from everywhere. Again, this shows what we've done, how our climate finance has increased from 9% in 2016 to 35% in 2019. We're hoping to get the 40% by 2020. We are doing so many other initiatives to support the bank. One of them being what we call Desert to Power. The Sahel is a zone of sunshine. Why should the people be in darkness when we have the cheapest solar products right now? We have the Clean Dev Special Fund, where we sustain Africa's climate centers. The World Bank published a report that Africa has 1/8, that's 1/8 of the minimum that is required for climate data centers to support development. That's not good enough. So we're working, we have a special initiative to strengthen the capacities of our climate centers. Then we have the adaptation benefit mechanism, which allows us, is an innovative mechanism we have created here at the bank for the global community that allows the private sector to come into the adaptation space. We have the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change. What does this do? Brings together all the financial institutions in Africa to move away from brown investments, fossil fuels, to realign their investments towards low carbon and climate resilient development. And then we have a circular economy. We cut, we use, we discard. We cannot sustain our development that way. So we're working on circularity. How would the output of one process, manufacturing process, what you may call a waste, become an input into the next process? And how do you create efficiency within that system while you are on it? And just last week, for most of you that would have noticed, we hosted the Africa Regional Office of the Global Center on Adaptation. This is a very strong partnership that we will work together to ensure that Africa's adaptive capacity is built. So in conclusion, we're working with the international community on a complementary and coherent manner to support the African continent. And this is where I want to leave this, that what can the academia do? I know, yes, it's a university that invited me. I thought I should at least use 2 minutes to speak to you. We're seeing siloed developments. We see climate change in the Faculty of Environmental Sciences or something related to that. And we're saying it's a cross-cutting thing. It's not something that you can silo into one department. I'm looking forward to where we can create new interdisciplinary collaborative spaces that a bioengineer will work with a civil engineer and a psychologist on a climate change issue, because it cuts through all those. I want to see us establish innovation hubs that will bring the private sector entrepreneurs into co-learning and development environments with university researchers. most times, I don't know about you in the US, but for us in Africa, we do research that goes nowhere. It stays on the shelf and we tick the box, we published. It has no practical implications. It cannot lead to new processes or development. I think we need to be more innovative, that we see our hubs can interact with entrepreneurs, and other development specialists. Thirdly, that we need to promote and enable circulation of talent. How do we bring practitioners in the field to work within the universities? How do you create that space that allows people in the field who've done things practically, who are the generators, manufacturers, to come do things with you? And then finally, innovations in curriculum design. Can a medical student take climate change as an elective in the Faculty of Environmental Sciences? Because that medical student needs to understand disease epidemiology and how climate change drives that epidemiology. Can we have a lawyer take electives in climate change, knowing that there are so many legal issues surrounding climate change? I think it's important for us to break whatever walls we have. At least on the African continent, this is where we found ourselves. We have walls between disciplines. This should not be the case anymore. So I want to thank you for listening to me. I leave you with this quote from Desmond Tutu, that 25 years ago, people could have been excused for not knowing much or doing much about climate change, but today we have no excuse. Please, if you need to know a little bit more of what we do on climate change, there is a website at the bottom. Please do check with us. Thank you very much for listening and for your attention.
Thank you very much. That is a very comprehensive outline of concerns and responses to those concerns. Given our time frame, I wanted to give people an opportunity to interact with you. We have a couple of questions, but and I want to kind of present one question, which is related to that. In the U.S., we've just seen published yesterday and today in the newspapers a scathing critique of documents which suggest that the oil industry, especially Exxon, knew that their that their products and their activities were contributing to the degradation of the environment in a lot of different ways, and they covered that up. I don't know if you saw that or not, but this is a major part of the private sector and how the private sector has responded to some of these environmental issues in Africa, just in terms of the collaboration between entrepreneurs and especially the international sector of entrepreneurs, which get very involved in the sale of resources and especially sources of power. And so I just, I just like to hear your comments in terms of that, and in terms of the kinds of collaborations that could exist, but then kind of this kind of duplicity which has continued to plague the world from some of the larger companies, which have been, energy-based companies, and the contribution they make to the degradation of the climate. And I'm presenting that as just a question about the relationship of the public good to the profits, and the relationship of how profits often supersede the public good, which leads people to engage in civil unrest, to almost demand some responses to issues of how the environment is treated, to issues of how countries respond to the health needs of the people. Did you hear a question in there?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll just quickly take that. It is not just Exxon now. Look at the cigarette companies. Before then, they all knew the issues and they covered them up. And they use, because they have so much money, they bought into the media and they carried out massive campaigns against that. Now we've seen the whole thing. We've been on this for years, and we know the oil majors have definitely bought into the public space, the media, to cover up what they have done. They have financed researches that have turned out to say that climate change is a hoax, it's not real. They've put in a lot of money into that. But it is now that people, which one day in the African proverb, they say 7 days is for the thief, 1 day is for the owner of the house. One day the owner of the house will open his eyes and say, wow, so this is what happened. And that's what's happening to the oil industry now. They are able to say that because they realize they can no longer continue to pay those heavy money because the price of crude has crashed. They now need to look for some alternative. So it's not new. It's been there at the international community. It's there in all our countries. They are financing those negative reports. So, but what I think we need to do is every country should deserve the right to look at what it considers beneficial for it and pursue it irrespective of whoever thinks otherwise. Thanks.
I'm trying to look at some of the questions that you've received. One individual asked Mr. Simone Richter, cities in the US, Charleston, for example, are starting to use fossil fuel companies, are starting to sue fossil fuel companies for climate change related damages. Since the African continent has contributed so little greenhouse gas emission, is litigation a way in which African cities and nations can bring money to Africa to invest in mitigation and adaptation?
Well,
in the same venue of the previous question, right?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because in the negotiations, climate change negotiations, have for years been talking about loss and damage. That means that countries who have caused the problem and caused the losses and the damage should be able to pay for it. And that has not seen the light of the day, basically, because countries say, we will agree to this on condition that you don't see it, you don't hold me liable, that I must pay for what we may have cost. And I think with the way it's going, that I keep using the cigarette example because it started gradually, it became a momentum, gathered so much momentum, a movement that people were now suing tobacco companies. I have a feeling that where countries are struggling so much, Africa, for instance, spends 2% of its GDP to deal with the aftermath of climate disasters. That's huge for poor countries. We see capital expenditure displacements, where a country that budgeted for education now takes that money to go to address people at the internally displaced camps because floods have moved them away. So they can't finance education, they can't finance any other development, but that money sinks into taking care of internally displaced people. So we're seeing many of those things. So I have a feeling that at some point, people will need to speak more coherently, better, to address these issues.
Thank you. So, in some ways, it reflects an inequity in terms of how the world is looking at Africa. I mean, one of the points that you made is only some insignificant 3% of climate financing is in Africa. And is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so if that's on one hand what's happening, that is an imbalance that exists in the world. Why does that imbalance exist? And what kind of things can people do to immediately begin to shift those processes?
Yeah, I think thanks so much for that. There are very many reasons why this imbalance exists. Most of these monies are investors' money. Investments go to where social capital exists and where also physical infrastructure exists. When you look at the ease of doing business of the World Bank, for instance, you realize that most African countries are way down. That's the way you define underdevelopment. That's the way they are. So investors would rather go to India, Malaysia, China, where those basic infrastructures are done. We don't have the much resources, and where we have, sometimes poor governance has also made sure that those resources are not appropriately applied. This end up either discouraging investors from coming in. Also, some of the processes to assessing these monies are so cumbersome that most times, most African countries cannot do it. I can tell you that there are countries in Africa that do not have climate data, meteorological data, they don't have it. So how do you force them to give you a historical record to demonstrate that climate change is a threat? They don't have it. And if they don't have it, they can't access your money. So there are issues that are there, and we think as a bank, for instance, we're working to address those issues to improve Africa's access to these climate finances.
I know we're almost at our end here. Can I get one more question in?
Yes, please.
I really like this question. I'm sorry, some of you, we didn't answer your questions. We won't get a chance to, but I just want to go to the last question that was entered here, which is, do you think that a climate change course should be a part of the required foundational classes for students at the University of Pennsylvania? And here are examples of foundational sectors currently at Penn: foreign languages, cultural analysis, cultural diversity in the US. So I'm going to just go online and say, I think it should be, but the question is to you, what do you think?
I believe, like I've said, it has to be foundational. Right now, I have the privilege of being on the advisory committee of the National Academies of Medicine of the US. And everyone, those big old professors, and everyone knows that this is it. Many of them wished they had known this many years ago, but now they are seeing it and coming into it. I believe that this should be a foundational course for everybody, because climate change affects everyone, and everyone has a role to play in your lifestyle, in the things you do to minimize emissions. It's very important. It is the cumulative activities of individuals and groups that will drive down emissions and also avert dangerous climate change.
Okay. Now, how much time do we have? Just get a time check.
We have about 7 more minutes.
7 more minutes? Okay, great. All right, good. Okay, why don't we go to another question? I was a little bit hasty there in my run-up. How do you suggest people respond to leaders and those in authority who deny the science behind climate change? Yes, sir.
I think this should be answered by an American. I would think so.
Yeah. I mean, it could be Brazilian too. It could be American, it could be Brazilian. I mean, there's some places where you have some heads of state who are actually climate change deniers, and individuals who are really adverse to science interfering with the successful production of markets or profit markets.
Frankly, it's unfortunate when you have a leader who refuses to believe science, either for political reasons or for economic reasons. But I also like what California does. It says, yes, we have a president, but I have a jurisdiction. And within that jurisdiction, I could do what I want to do. So, California has very innovative, very enduring policies towards climate. I also believe, even in Africa, you have a head of state, even if he says, I don't believe in it, you have governors that govern provinces. You have local government chairmen that govern smaller enclaves. Do what you need to do. let the man at the head be.
Here's a question. Where in Africa are these conditions being met at this moment? That is, where is there a government which has the right orientation and where they're receiving this kind of dividend of climate finance as you've kind of described it?
Let me use the normal cases we do. You have Rwanda. We're seeing what is happening in Rwanda, and they're receiving quite substantial amount of money because that is a leader with his head on his neck. Let me put it that way. He's driving innovative policies, and so on. It's when people did not think it was possible, he banned plastics. He said, this is very dangerous, and it has stayed. He has brought about cleanliness, the methane that you find from West in many African cities, dirty cities. You can't find that in Kigali. Then you go to Kenya. Kenya is also at the forefront, doing what it needs to do. It developed the Turkana wind farm, which is one of the largest wind farms thus far, and is doing so many other things to make sure that its climate policies are enshrined in the Constitution. I don't see how else a leader would demonstrate commitment other than that, to that extent.
Is there is there a kind of ranking of countries by their climate policy and their kind of climate financing?
We started an initiative called the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change that is supposed to rank institutions on how much they are contributing to climate change. We're working on that. We have an index we're developing. But we also have what we call the Africa Green Growth Index, which more like answers your question, that we rank countries. We've not released the first level yet because, countries don't feel comfortable to say, I came last, I came second. And these are our shareholders, so we're working with that. But the Africa Green Growth Index, which my department is working on, ranks countries to see how ready are they for green growth investments. And that means, that includes climate change, includes many other things. How prepared are you? Which means you have the right policy, you have the right instruments, you have the right name them. So that is there, but it's a bit political now to release it. So we're working on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'd be interesting to also see the other side too, though, because the other side is the actual financing, the actual stimulations of the stuff to respond to what this is, right? And to what degree are those kinds of things being done? You're saying you're ranking companies based on their contribution?
Yeah, how they align their resources towards climate change.
Okay, so that's the two sides.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. I want to thank you so much for this stimulating conversation. I think your comments and your presentation opened a lot of questions, and hopefully those questions will resonate. I really, really appreciate your call for a foundational series of courses on climate change being instituted at all the universities around the world as the basic element for teaching people to have a liberal education, as we say. So thank you very much, and it has been my great pleasure.
Thank you so very much for the invitation. And Oseke, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for the privilege.
Thank you so much, Prof. We are very, very grateful, and we have learned a lot from you today. Prof. Zuberi, thank you for being a very kind moderator. Your presence is well appreciated. And one of the things you said, Prof. Young, is you talked about blockchain, technology, drones, AI, machine learning, and certainly those are the things that we do at Penn Engineering.
Okay.
So it melds very well with your topic. And in fact, I'll invite our guests or the participants to join us again tomorrow. We'll have Penn Engineering Associate Dean for Research, Sherry Keegan, will be talking about advancing technology to ensure food, energy, and water security. So it very nicely segues your talk series to our program tomorrow. But from all of us at Penn Engineering, the Green Team, our Dean, Associate Deans, and also from Penn Climate Week Committee, we want to thank you very much for making time for us to be part of this program. I think your lecture and talk is well received. Prof. Tufuku, thank you so much. You are fantastic. And I look forward to seeing you when we can gather on campus.
Yes. I look forward to those days.
Fantastic.
I look forward.
So thank you all for participating in this program, and please join us again tomorrow, where we'll have Prof. Sherry Keegan to talk about advancing technology to ensure food, energy, and water security. Until then, have a very, very fine day, and please stay safe from COVID. Thank you.